The sun hung heavy over the rolling fields of the Virginia plantation, where the sound of a distant whip cracked the air, punctuating the rhythm of the workers' labor. For Sarah, a young enslaved woman on the Harrington estate, the day began like any other. The heat of the southern sun burned down on the cotton fields, and the weight of the chains on her soul felt no lighter. But for Sarah, there was something else. A quiet defiance beneath her tired exterior. A fire that burned inside her that no one, not even her master, had ever seen. Her life had been defined by her silence. She had been born into the servitude of the Harringtons, forced to work for them from the time she could walk. Margaret Harrington, the mistress of the estate, saw Sarah not as a person but as a tool to be used first for her labor and then for her husband's pleasure. It had been a cold and brutal relationship, one built on ownership and control, but Sarah never allowed it to break her spirit completely. But one night, everything changed. Sarah became pregnant, a child born from the forced intimacy with Thomas Harrington, the master of the estate. A child that carried the blood of the oppressor and the oppressed, two lives inside of her that would be torn apart by the cruel divide of race and privilege. The birth of the twins, one black and one white, would shatter the fragile illusion of control that had defined the Harrington plantation for years. For Sarah, the birth was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of her suffering, there was power she would not let go. What happened next would shock not just the plantation, but the very foundations of the world Sarah had been forced to endure. The story of a mother's love, of a family divided by the color of their skin, and of the quiet rebellion that would reshape everything, was about to unfold. Before we move forward, I ask you, where are you watching from? What time is it there? And what would you do if you were forced to choose between the family you loved and the legacy of oppression that had been forced upon you? Drop a comment below, and if you find yourself drawn to tales of resilience and resistance, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been hidden for generations in the shadows of the past. The air on the Harrington plantation was thick with heat and the scent of freshly tilled soil. The endless cotton fields stretched as far as the eye could see, shimmering in the sun like a sea of white, waiting to be harvested. Sarah, her hands raw from years of picking, worked tirelessly alongside the other enslaved women, her back bent with the weight of the labor. But beneath the sweat and the pain, there was a quiet strength in Sarah's movements, a strength born not from physical power, but from the fire that burned in her chest. The plantation was a world of rigid control, where the masters dictated every aspect of life, from the rhythm of the workday to the quiet moments of respite that came only in the dead of night. But Sarah had learned early on to endure. She had learned to silence her own voice, to hold her head down when the masters walked by, to say nothing, to be nothing. It was the way of the world, her world, one where the enslaved were tools, not people. Her mistress, Margaret Harrington, was a woman of sharp eyes and sharp words. She carried herself with the haughty grace of someone born into privilege, a woman who believed herself to be above reproach, above consequence. Margaret had always viewed Sarah with a mixture of contempt and jealousy. Sarah's beauty was undeniable, and Thomas Harrington, the master of the estate, had made no secret of his attraction to the young enslaved woman. The relationship between Margaret and Sarah was one of quiet but deep disdain, a silent battle of wills, each woman vying for control in a world where Sarah had no voice, no power. For years, Sarah had endured Thomas's advances, his cold, calculated attempts to take from her what was not his to claim. But Sarah, for all her silence, had a strength Margaret could not see, a power that had yet to be realized. She knew how to navigate the plantation's web of authority, how to move unseen, how to keep her dignity intact in a world that sought to strip it from her. But there were moments, small moments, that reminded Sarah of her own humanity. It was one of those moments when Thomas took her aside one late evening, away from the prying eyes of the house. He smiled at her, the smile of a man who believed his actions were above reproach. His hands brushed against her skin, and though Sarah's body remained still, her mind began to race with the reality of her situation. She was nothing more than a tool for his pleasure, just as Margaret was nothing more than a trophy wife for his status. Sarah had been forced into this life, forced into servitude, forced into silence, but she was not broken. By the time Sarah learned she was pregnant, It was too late to undo the damage that had already been done. She had been carrying the weight of her oppression for far too long, but now it was literal. A child, 2 children, would soon grow inside her, one dark, one light. A union of her oppression and her master's cruelty, a reminder that no matter how silent she had been, the world would never allow her to forget where she came from. As the months passed, Sarah's body changed, growing heavier with each passing week. She continued to work in the fields, her hands moving mechanically through the cotton, but in her mind, she was somewhere else. She would often steal moments of peace when no one was watching, staring out at the vast expanse of the plantation, imagining what life might be like if she were free, if her children could live without the weight of their heritage. Margaret, too, had begun to notice the changes. She watched Sarah closely, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. There were whispers in the house, murmurs of Sarah's pregnancy, and Margaret's jealousy began to mount. She saw the birth of these children as a threat, as an affront to everything she held dear. Sarah's growing belly was a constant reminder that her husband had taken something from her, something that she could never take back. And as the days wore on, Sarah's fear of what was to come began to grow. But even in the face of that fear, one thought remained constant in her mind. Her children, no matter what their color, would never be slaves. They would never be broken, not by Margaret, not by Thomas, not by the world that had made them. The days leading up to Sarah's labor were filled with a heavy, unspoken tension. Her body, once strong and resilient, had begun to show the strains of the pregnancy. The other enslaved women whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with pity, fear, and a quiet sense of awe for the woman who carried not just the child of her oppressor, but the weight of a system that had long sought to break her. Sarah's every movement was slower now, each step heavier than the last. She worked in the fields until her body could no longer endure the grueling labor, and Margaret, though she kept a close watch, didn't dare comment too much time had passed, and too many questions lingered in the air for her to risk confronting Sarah directly. She watched with a kind of nervous detachment, a jealousy simmering beneath her cool exterior, as Sarah's belly swelled further. The night Sarah's contractions began, the air was thick with the scent of rain, the oppressive heat of the day having given way to a cooler breeze. The sky crackled with distant thunder, and Sarah, alone in her quarters, could feel the baby know. Babies inside her shift, with each tightening wave of pain. Her breath hitched, and for the first time in months, she felt something else besides the weight of the plantation. She felt the life she had carried inside her stir. The pain was sharp, more intense than she had expected, and for a moment, she allowed herself to scream, her voice breaking the silence of the night. But just as quickly, she stilled herself. She could not afford to be weak, to let the sound of her pain reach the ears of the overseers or Margaret. The others in the quarters heard her, though, and their sympathetic glances were a quiet support in the midst of her isolation. By the time Sarah was taken to the house to give birth, her body was weary, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. Margaret, ever the mistress of the estate, insisted on overseeing the birth. She stood at the door to Sarah's room, watching with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. Her eyes flicked to the servant midwife, then to Sarah, who lay on the bed, her body slick with sweat. The midwife did her best to ignore the mistress's presence, but the tension in the room was palpable. "I expect everything to go smoothly, Sarah," Margaret said, her voice cold and calculating. She stood rigidly, her eyes not on Sarah, but on the servants, on the room itself. "I don't want to hear any complaints. You will raise these children properly, and I expect them to be well behaved." Sarah gritted her teeth, her hands clutching the edges of the bed. She knew that Margaret had no compassion for her, no understanding of the pain she endured. The child within her was a reminder of a twisted relationship, a mark of her suffering. She had no choice but to endure. The first cry broke the silence. Sharp and loud, a cry that echoed in the room and made Margaret flinch. The baby was here. Sarah, though exhausted, let out a sigh of relief. But there was little time to celebrate. The midwife quickly handed the child over, cleaning its skin, its small features already taking shape. Sarah could feel a warmth spreading through her chest as the midwife handed her the first child, a dark-skinned boy, his face a mirror of her own. She gazed at him, a mixture of love and sorrow filling her heart. He was beautiful, her son, but in the world he was born into, his beauty would never be enough to protect him. He would carry the weight of her legacy and the burden of the system that had created him. But there was no time for reflection. The labor continued, the pain sharp and persistent. The second baby was on its way. The hours dragged by, and the room filled with the sound of Sarah's pained breaths and Margaret's impatient shifting. When the second baby was finally born, the room fell into a stunned silence. The child was pale, almost white in complexion, with fair hair and delicate features. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she looked down at the child in her arms. It was a girl who looked nothing like her, but everything like Thomas. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on Sarah's chest. The baby, her daughter, was the child of the man who had abused her, the man who had used her body as a means of fulfilling his desires. And yet, in her arms, the baby seemed so innocent, so helpless. She was both a part of Sarah and a part of the man who had stolen her sense of dignity. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. The sight of the two children, one dark, one light, was enough to stop her heart. For a moment, there was no sound but the steady breathing of Sarah and the quiet cries of the newborns. Margaret's voice, sharp and laced with disbelief, broke the silence. "What is this?" she demanded, her eyes flicking between the two babies. "What kind of curse is this?" But Sarah said nothing. She looked down at her children, feeling a profound sense of helplessness wash over her. She had given birth to two children who were bound by blood, but divided by the cruel system that sought to define their worth. In this moment, she knew that they would never be allowed to simply be children. They would be defined by the color of their skin, by the legacy of oppression they had been born into. She held them close, her heart heavy with the weight of their fates. In her arms, they were just babies, innocent, pure. But outside of this room, in the world they were born into, their lives would be anything but innocent. Margaret's voice cracked with fury. "I will not have these children on my estate. This is a disgrace," she spat, her face contorted with rage. But Sarah, despite the weight of the world pressing down on her, turned her face toward Margaret. "They are my children," she said softly, her voice steady with quiet defiance. "And no matter what you say, they are as much a part of this world as you are." The days following the birth of Sarah's twins were filled with a tension so thick it seemed to seep into every corner of the plantation. Sarah, still recovering from the pain of childbirth, was left to care for both children in secret. Margaret, the plantation mistress, fumed in silence, her fury simmering beneath the surface. The plantation house, once a place of authority, was now overshadowed by an air of uncertainty. Samuel Hargrove, the master of the estate, had yet to return from his trip, and Margaret, though still in mourning over the loss of her power, found herself unable to do anything but seethe with anger at the injustice of it all. The very existence of Sarah's children was a blight on her world, a symbol of the betrayal she could not erase. She had not expected this. The birth of a child. Yes, that was one thing. But to have both children born of her own husband's blood, one black, one white, was a humiliation she could not process. The cruelty of it wasn't just in the fact that Sarah had been forced to bear these children, but in the twisted irony that the very child who looked like Thomas would be raised in her home, in her world, while the other, dark-skinned and marked as a slave, would be cast aside and forgotten. Margaret, when she did speak of it, often referred to the children as the abomination in the privacy of her own quarters, hissing her disgust at the thought of their existence. She was not just angry at Sarah, but at the audacity of the situation itself. She hated the sight of the fair-skinned boy, William, as he nursed at Sarah's breast, a cruel reminder of her own helplessness. To her, he was a symbol of her husband's betrayal, of the way her life, her entire identity, had been undermined by the very people she had considered inferior. But her rage toward the children was not just personal. It was rooted in the system of power that had made her who she was. Margaret, much like the rest of society, viewed race and ownership as natural laws, things that could never be crossed. For a child of hers to be born from a slave born of the blood of an enslaved woman was a blasphemy against the very social order she had fought so hard to uphold. One afternoon, as Sarah held both babies in the small quarters she had been assigned, Margaret barged into the room, her face twisted with fury. "You will not keep them together," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut through the room. She pointed to the twins with disgust, the contempt she felt for Sarah evident in every word she spoke. Sarah, who had been staring down at her two children, felt her chest tighten. She had known this moment would come. Margaret had always treated her with disdain, but now the fury was even more intense. Margaret wasn't just angry at Sarah's defiance. She was angry that she had no power over what had happened. The children were Sarah's, and that was something Margaret could not control. "They are my children," Sarah replied quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging around her. She looked down at William, her fair-skinned son, whose innocent eyes gazed up at her without comprehension of the world he had been born into. Beside him, Elijah, the darker twin, slept soundly, blissfully unaware of the hatred that surrounded them both. "You will not raise them together," Margaret repeated, her voice now dripping with venom. "The boy with the light skin will be mine. The other, he is a slave, and he will remain with the others. He will never be a part of this family." Sarah's heart tightened as she looked at her son, William, the child who had been born with the color of his oppressors, who would have a life that was far different from his twin. But Sarah would not bend to Margaret's will. She refused to let her children be divided by something so arbitrary as skin color. Margaret stepped forward, her eyes flashing with an intensity that made Sarah recoil. "You're nothing but a tool," Margaret hissed. "You've birthed this mockery of a family, and now you will live with it." She turned on her heel, storming out of the room without another word. The air in the room felt heavy with the aftermath of the confrontation. Sarah clutched her children closer to her chest, feeling the weight of the decisions she would soon have to make. The world was forcing them apart before they even had a chance to know each other, but Sarah wouldn't allow it. She would fight to keep her family together, no matter the cost. As the weeks passed, Sarah's resolve hardened. Margaret's attempts to separate the twins were relentless. William was taken from her frequently, and though Sarah was allowed brief moments with him, it was clear that the child's upbringing would be vastly different from that of his darker twin. William was raised with the privileges of a master's child, while Elijah remained in the quarters, growing up in the harshness of slavery, with no protection or promises of a better future. But even in the harshest of conditions, Sarah's love for her children remained steadfast. She would whisper to Elijah at night, telling him stories of his twin brother, of the bond they shared, and of the world they might one day see together. She had known from the moment they were born that their lives would never be the same, but she would raise them to know each other, to understand that they were more than the sum of their circumstances. Margaret's fury never subsided, and neither did the ever-present weight of the oppressive system that held Sarah and her children in chains. But through every threat, every punishment, Sarah held on to the hope that one day, her sons, no matter their color, would find a way to be free. As the years passed, the stark contrast between the lives of Sarah's twins became undeniable. William, the fair-skinned son of Margaret, was raised in the lap of privilege, sheltered from the harshness of the plantation's true nature. His days were spent in the comfort of the mansion, surrounded by the finest clothes, the softest bedding, and an education that promised him a future beyond the fields. Margaret doted on him, her love for him tempered only by the quiet resentment she harbored for the dark-skinned child who reminded her of the bitterness she could never erase. Elijah, on the other hand, grew up in the shadow of his brother's comforts. He was kept in the slave quarters, where the air was thick with the weight of his mother's sacrifice and the relentless cruelty of the plantation. He wore the same rough clothes as the other enslaved children, his skin a constant reminder of the division that had been drawn between them. Though he was raised with his brother's blood, the differences between them could not have been more pronounced. Elijah's childhood was marked by the same struggle that all enslaved children faced: endless labor, the threat of punishment, and the deep knowledge that his future was already decided for him. He had no chance of escape, no hope of ever being more than what he was. His mother, Sarah, whispered to him in the quiet of the night, reminding him of the bond they shared with William, of the love that transcended the world that sought to tear them apart. But the world outside their small quarters told a different story. William, unaware of the suffering of his twin, grew up sheltered. Margaret made sure of it. He was taught to read and write, to study the ways of the masters, to prepare for a life that would one day be his to command. As he grew older, he took on more responsibilities around the plantation, though his tasks were always light compared to the grueling work Elijah endured. William had a childhood filled with play, with leisure, and with the knowledge that he was destined for something greater than the land he had been born to. But Elijah's awareness grew as well. He saw his brother from a distance, often through the windows of the mansion or from the fields where he worked. He would watch William ride by on horseback, his face full of youthful joy and ignorance. The child he once shared a bond with was now a stranger, living in a world so different from his own that it seemed like they were born on different planets. Elijah's bitterness grew, fueled by the anger of being forced into a life that was not his own. He resented William for the life he had been given, for the opportunities he would never have. He resented his mother for the love she gave him, and yet the world would never allow him to live as she wished. He resented the masters, the overseers, and the very system that allowed one child to live freely while the other was enslaved. There were times when Elijah would stand in the fields, staring out at the mansion in the distance, and wonder if William ever thought of him. Did he ever wonder about the brother he had never been allowed to know? Did he ever question why his life was so different from Elijah's? Elijah had no answers, only the ache of unspoken questions that seemed to cut deeper with each passing day. One day, as the twins neared adolescence, they crossed paths in the most unlikely of places. It was a warm afternoon, the sun high in the sky, and Elijah had been sent to deliver an order from his mother to the house. He entered the yard near the stables, his heart racing with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. He knew it was a rare chance to see William face to face, and he wasn't sure if he was prepared for the encounter. William was there, mounted on his horse, his face flushed from the day's heat. He saw Elijah approaching and, for a moment, paused. His eyes widened in surprise. There was something unfamiliar about the boy standing before him. It was as if, for the first time, William was seeing the reality of their existence laid bare before him. Elijah stood still, his fists clenched by his sides. He hadn't spoken to his brother in years, and the sudden meeting filled him with a mix of rage, sorrow, and disbelief. William seemed unsure of what to say, his gaze flicking from Elijah to the mansion in the distance. Finally, William spoke, his voice awkward. "What are you doing here?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "I've come to deliver a message," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The resentment in his chest bubbled up, but he kept it contained, not wanting to reveal the full weight of his anger. William studied him, his eyes narrowing. "You're still working in the fields, aren't you?" he asked, as if the idea of a life spent in the fields was nothing more than a passing thought. Elijah's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he felt the sting of being seen as less than human. But then, a sharp, bitter laugh escaped him. "Yes, William, I am still in the fields." He looked at his brother, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this boy, this child of privilege, would never truly understand what it meant to live like him. William seemed to struggle with his words, his face a mixture of guilt and confusion. "I never," he began, but he faltered, unable to finish the thought. Elijah's gaze softened, but only slightly. He understood. William had been raised to be ignorant of the world outside the walls of his mansion. He had never been forced to look at the realities of their existence, never been given the opportunity to see his brother as anything other than a shadow on the edges of his life. "It doesn't matter," Elijah said, his voice quiet now, filled with a weariness that came from years of suffering. "You have your life, I have mine, and that's how it will always be." William opened his mouth to say something, but Elijah turned and walked away, leaving his brother standing by the stables, unsure of what to think, unsure of what to say. As Elijah disappeared into the fields once more, his heart heavy with the weight of their unspoken bond, he knew that things could never go back to the way they once were. The gulf between them had grown too wide, too deep. And in the silence of that moment, Elijah understood that their fates had already been sealed long ago by the color of their skin, by the world they had been born into. Now, the distance between them seemed insurmountable. "You don't understand, William," Elijah said, his voice tinged with pain. "You've had a life of comfort, of privilege, and I've had a life of struggle, of humiliation. We share the same blood, but the world sees us as two different people." William opened his mouth to respond, but Elijah held up a hand, stopping him. "You live in the mansion, you ride horses and dine with the masters, while I work in the fields like an animal." His voice broke slightly, the bitterness and frustration evident in every word. "You've never had to fight for your life the way I have." William stood motionless, the weight of Elijah's words sinking in. "I didn't ask for this," he murmured, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I never wanted things to be this way." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "You never wanted it, but you've never questioned it either. You've never had to." His gaze softened for a moment, but only just. "You don't know what it's like to be torn between two worlds, to carry the weight of who you are every single day." The words hung in the air between them, charged with a deep, unspoken truth. William, despite his guilt, had never known the life Elijah had lived. He had never been forced to face the brutality of slavery, the constant reminder that his worth was determined by his race. He had never felt the sting of injustice in the way Elijah had. "I know this isn't your fault," Elijah continued, his voice quieter now, almost tired. "But you have to understand, I've spent my life knowing that I'm not worthy of the same things you are, that my blood is cursed because of the color of my skin." For a long moment, neither spoke. William, his face a mixture of guilt and realization, seemed lost in the gravity of what his brother was saying. "I never asked to be born this way," William said finally, his voice soft, almost pleading. "I never asked for the life I have. But I see now what you mean. I see the world through a lens I never thought to question." Elijah's gaze softened, just a fraction. He could see the conflict in his brother's eyes, the genuine desire to understand. But the years of separation, the years of unspoken resentment, had built a wall between them that was difficult to bridge. "I know you didn't ask for it," Elijah said, his tone quieter now. "But you still have a chance to see the truth, a chance to do something, to change things. You don't have to live like this." William's eyes flickered with something regret, guilt, and the first spark of understanding. "What do you want me to do, Elijah?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, there was a brief moment of connection between the two brothers. "I want you to see me," Elijah said, his voice strong again, filled with quiet power. "Not as a slave, not as someone beneath you, but as your brother, as a man who deserves a life, a future, and the same freedom you've been given. I want you to do something about it. I want you to stand with me." William swallowed, his face conflicted. "But what can I do?" Elijah's gaze was unwavering. "You can change the system. You can change the world. You have the power to fight for what's right. Don't ignore this. Don't let it continue." The days after their confrontation were filled with a silent tension, a tension that neither William nor Elijah could escape. The plantation, which had once seemed like a world they both shared, now felt like two entirely separate realities colliding. For the first time, William saw the system that had shaped his life, his privilege, and his family. And for the first time, Elijah saw a glimmer of hope that the world could be different if only they were willing to fight for it. Elijah returned to the fields, his heart still heavy with the conversation that had left so much unsaid. It was a small victory, perhaps a crack in the wall that separated him from his brother, but he knew better than to believe it was enough. The road to change was long, and the obstacles were insurmountable. But the weight of the truth had been planted in William's mind, and Elijah could only hope it would grow into something more than just regret. William, on the other hand, was haunted by the conversation. He could no longer ignore the truth that Elijah had laid bare before him. He had grown up in a world of wealth and ease, never questioning the disparity between himself and the enslaved workers who had been forced to labor under the Harrington name. Now, Every corner of the plantation felt different. Every glance exchanged with the enslaved filled with the uncomfortable weight of knowledge. William knew that he couldn't simply go back to his life as it had been. He couldn't continue to ignore the suffering around him, nor could he continue to stand by as his brother and the others endured their oppression. For the first time, he began to understand what Elijah had meant when he spoke of the chains that bound him. It wasn't just the physical chains that kept the enslaved in line, it was the system itself. The societal structure that upheld the institution of slavery and allowed men like Thomas Harrington to live in wealth while others suffered. As days turned into weeks, William began to observe his own family differently. He looked at his father, the man who had made his fortune off the backs of those he claimed as property, and his heart hardened with a mixture of anger and guilt. He could not erase the years of complacency, the years spent in the luxury of ignorance. But he could begin to act. He started small, seeking out books on abolition and discussing the issue in hushed tones with trusted allies in the nearby towns. He met with a group of local abolitionists who had long been working to undermine the plantation system, their efforts mostly under the radar, their hopes dimmed by the overwhelming power of the slave-owning elite. William, now older and more aware, joined their efforts, slowly building connections with those who fought against the very system he had once benefited from. But change, as Elijah had warned, was never easy. William faced constant obstacles not just from the other masters and overseers, but from the very people he had once called friends. They saw his newfound sympathy as weakness, and his refusal to support the institution of slavery began to cast doubt on his standing within the community. Thomas Harrington, his father, became increasingly suspicious of William's actions, though he said nothing directly. And then there was Margaret. The hatred that boiled within her only grew as she saw the growing divide between William and the rest of the plantation. Her sharp tongue and her biting words cut through the house like a knife, and it was clear to everyone that she despised the very notion that William might break away from the family's traditions. She saw his actions as a betrayal, and every moment spent with him was filled with tension. One evening, Margaret cornered William in the mansion's grand parlor, her eyes full of fury. "I don't know what's gotten into you," she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "But I will not allow you to tarnish the family name. I will not stand by and watch you ruin everything your father and I have worked for." William stood firm, his posture stiff with resolve. He had spent too long in the shadows, allowing others to dictate his life. He would no longer be the person they expected him to be. "I won't be a part of this any longer, Mother," he said quietly, but with authority. "I can't live in a world where I turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. You may not understand it, but I have to do what's right." Margaret's face twisted with disgust. "You will ruin this family, William. You will lose everything. And for what? For these people?" Her voice trembled with the weight of her disbelief. William didn't respond. He didn't need to. Margaret's words were hollow, and they no longer held the power they once had. The plantation, the life of wealth and privilege, everything that had been built on the backs of the enslaved, was no longer a world he could inhabit with a clean conscience. The final confrontation between mother and son marked a turning point for William. It was no longer just about breaking from the plantation, it was about breaking free from the suffocating legacy of his family, from the systemic oppression that had defined his life. That night, as the moon rose over the fields, William found Elijah once again. The two brothers stood together in the quiet of the night, their words few but their bond stronger than ever. William, though unsure of what the future would hold, knew one thing for certain. He could no longer live in the shadow of the plantation. He would stand with his brother, not as an heir to the estate, but as a man who understood the true cost of freedom. "I'm with you, Elijah," William said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We'll find a way to change things, together." Elijah nodded, his eyes steady and filled with the quiet resolve that had driven him from the beginning. "Then we fight, William. We fight for what's right. We fight for those who can't." The two brothers stood there in the moonlight, no longer divided by their past, no longer defined by the system that had sought to keep them apart. They would fight, not just for freedom, but for a future where their children and the children of the enslaved could live without the chains of oppression that had bound their ancestors.